Hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. I'm with the Summer Proctor World History Program. Today is March 10th, 2022. Who do I have the pleasure of speaking with today?
My name is Tim Schwartzman.
All right, Tim, if you could just tell me a little bit about kind of who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So actually, I'm one of the owners of a family-owned attraction in the middle of the Everglades. The park is called Sawgrass Recreation Park. We offer eco tours on airboats out into the Everglades and into the marshes, and to educate our visitors and locals as well about our ecosystem and about the wildlife. We also have a small animal rescue on site where we've taken in and adopted animals that basically needed a second chance or were no longer wanted by their owners and that kind of thing. And that's kind of like a small little educational area as well, where people could see alligators and pythons and turtles and all kinds of cool animals.
Fantastic. And how long have you been doing this?
So we've been here about 16 years now. We took over from the previous owners of the park. Parks actually was established in 1962. It was a fish camp at first, so literally you can get your John boat fixed up, buy some bait, and go out on the water. And then shortly after, the second owner is when they started doing the airboat tours. But we've grown it into a fleet of 20 boats and roughly between about 100,000, 150,000 guests per year that come through here.
Wow. So, 10, 20 boats, 100,000 guests per year. It seems like, your business is definitely growing. So,
yeah. We've actually, with COVID and everything, of course, we took a huge hit like everyone. We just had no business for most of 2020. Even once we were able to reopen, it was very quiet. It's probably the lowest numbers we've ever seen, even from the inception of the park. But actually, it kind of forced us to look at how we run our business and the type of business we're bringing in. Instead of these large busloads of people, we're kind of more focused more on the private family group that wants to go on their own boat and kind of the average drive-in person that comes on their own without coming on a tour specifically. And even though we have less people coming in the door now, it's better on the whole setup. The boats aren't working as hard. The people that work for us aren't working as hard. And we've been able to generate more revenue than before COVID, actually, just by kind of, dancing around like everyone, kind of adapting to a changing world, So we've been doing much better now than we were, 2 years ago.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's always nice to see people kind of be a little bit better off.
Yeah.
So, discuss the implications of that, right? So it's like your business model has changed. You said these big kind of groups of people. It's more kind of family oriented.
Yeah.
Why is that significant? In terms of why people do that, right? Why do you have these family kind of groups coming to your place?
Part of it is the shift in the overall kind of tourism industry. I travel a lot myself, and there's a lot of you go on a cruise and you want to take a trip somewhere. You have to kind of go through a third party that puts you on a bus and it takes you to the location. And realistically, I think more and more people are going directly to the place they want to go to's website and booking their own setup. And honestly, most of the time for them, it actually costs less for them. But also the facility you're going to makes all the money instead of a third party being involved. So you're starting to see a little bit more of that, kind of more of a savvy shopper, if you will, that kind of really wants to try to get the best bang for their buck, but also save a little money in the long term too.
And, so what's the appeal, right? Why do people come here? Why do people choose you?
Well, I think probably most people come to South Florida for shopping and beaches, of course. Yeah. But once they get here, the Everglades is really the number one thing on most people's list because it is a unique ecosystem. It's not found anywhere else on the planet. There is only one Everglades. There are a lot of other wetland ecosystems, but this is the only one that works the way it does. And at the same time, it's an airboat. It's half boat, half plane. It's something that most people have never seen, let alone ride on. So I think a lot of that, and of course, everyone wants to see alligators and wildlife. We've got all that out here.
So kind of tell me a little bit about how you grew up. Did you grow up in this area?
Actually, yeah. I grew up in an area that was a small town. It's now a pretty good-sized suburb of Fort Lauderdale called Pembroke Pines. And basically spent most of my days as kids, running around, riding bikes around the levees and, heading out into the Everglades with buddies on their boats and stuff and catching frogs and turtles and, fishing and all that. And then, over the years, I met my wife and her family and I all kind of at the same time that we got together, came in and took over the park operations here. And it's only been uphill from there, I guess you say.
And what appealed to you about this type of business? Why do this compared to anything else?
So realistically, okay, well, wait a second. Yeah, he's coming in to land. Tried to avoid boats, but hunters, and I guess it's almost the weekend.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, there's another one. Actually, I believe that's the invasive vegetation people. So they go out on boats and they find all the Brazilian pepper and then the invasive plants and stuff, and they trying to get rid of them as much as they can. Sounds like it's quiet enough now.
Yeah, you can.
All right, cool. So realistically, how we got started in this was kind of interesting for me. It was kind of just, it happened. It wasn't really something I was seeking to go do. In fact, I went to school after high school. I went to go and got a degree in audio engineering and recording music. And I was always a musician as a kid. I played in rock bands and stuff in high school. And so that was kind of my path. And then Hurricane Wilma came through in 2005 and it blew right through this area. And it was literally 2 weeks after my father-in-law had actually just bought the park from the previous owner. And it decimated all the boats. It wiped out half the building. Most of our animal exhibits, the animals themselves were fine, but the exhibits were all destroyed. Where I was currently working and in my school were both without power for over a month. Wow. And so I had nothing to do. So I was like, let me go help out. And me helping out turned into a full-time job. And I actually worked with our animal exhibit for about 10 years. I was like the main gator handler, keeper. I did all the talks and shows and educational stuff. I did the cleaning and picking up and feeding of all the animals and even moving some of the animals when we had to. So I kind of had to learn quite a bit there as far as wildlife and how they work in their head, And then after about 10 years of our park growing, there was a need for most of us in the family to kind of step back and take more of a managerial role and not doing the day-to-day stuff. So that was basically that was about probably 8 years ago that happened. And now basically, between myself, my brother-in-law, his sister is my wife, and their mother, we've been running it for the last, about 5 or 6 years.
It's amazing. So kind of talk about some of the, unique species that you kind of find here, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
So throughout the Everglades, of course, you have a variety of habitats. Mostly where we're at is going to be the wetlands, the marsh, the wettest part of the Everglades, the lowest lying area. So there's going to be a lot of birds, everything from, small, tiny little, what we call black-necked stilts. They're actually more of a shore bird, but they come inland for nesting during the dry season. And we get, large egrets and heron populations, spoonbills, roseate spoonbills. And of course, obviously, we get lots of turtles and frogs and amphibious animals. We see soft-shell turtles. We see the occasional common snappers, and then, of course, all the slider turtles. And then, of course, obviously, the most infamous animal of the Everglades, but also just anywhere in Florida, which is the American alligator. And then a variety of other animals that we see kind of a little more erratically, things like snakes and, smaller birds and smaller insects and fish, which are obviously going to be hard to spot from an airboat going 30 miles an hour. But sometimes you just stop for a moment and shut the motor off and enjoy the quiet, and you look over and there's a snake sitting there. So it's kind of random. We never really know what we're going to see out there. I was just out for 4 or 5 hours this morning breaking in a new boat, and the whole time I was out there, I saw all kinds of different wildlife, from roseate spoonbills to 12-foot alligators, and I saw a few hatchlings from last year that were out there. That was pretty cool. Don't get to see the little guys very often.
So, when you take people on boats, right? What do you include some form of education aspects?
Yeah. So we have different tour options. Our general admission tour is about a 30-minute ride. So there's a little bit of a limited time frame that we have to really get their attention and, of course, keep their attention, which most people are on vacation, so they're not really looking to go to school. But we try to at least give them a little information about the basics of the basic plumbing of the Everglades and how historically how it would have worked versus with the levee systems and drainage and flood control, how it works now. Talk about the difference between wet season and dry season and how that impacts the animals and how their cycles actually follow the rain, as far as nesting and mating and things like that. And then, of course, at the same time, just getting the wind in their hair and the sun on their face and some fresh air. Most of these people, of course, are coming from, places that are much colder than we are, especially this time of year in the springtime where, they call home and they're here at 85, 90 degrees and at home it's, 17 below. So for them, I think it's kind of 50-50. They want to go fast. They want to get some fresh air and some sunshine and not have to shovel snow. But also you get that couple minutes of time where you can at least give them a little basic background information about the Everglades.
Do you find that people usually kind of leave here with an appreciation of kind of what they saw? I mean, do you think it kind of sticks when you go back home?
I think there's there's three types of people. There's the people that just, no matter what you tell them, they weren't really listening anyway because they just want to get some sunshine, drink a beer on a boat, and just relax and see an alligator. And then you get the second, which I think is probably the most common type of person we get here, that they leave here with a basic understanding of the Everglades and just an overall appreciation of how complex of an ecosystem it is. And then the third is going to be kind of just the people that are just appreciating the fact that they were outdoors. Not so much that they learned specifically about the Everglades, but just nature in general. And they're the type of people that probably go on hikes in the mountains, and then they go out on the boat in the ocean. They kind of experience all different parts of nature. I think for a lot of these people, though, like most people nowadays, we live in cities and towns, and we don't get to see, just a small fraction of the environment around us. So for them, it's just a way to kind of get away from town and get out on the water and be out in the natural world, and learn a little something along the way.
So kind of, I thought that was really interesting. What you were kind of just saying, right? So, I mean, kind of elaborate on those two types of people then, right? It's like, when we do try to, when we do try to implement environmental change, right? It's like, how do we get person one to care a little more, or at least not get in the way of like kind of.
So when I give tours, especially when we do like field trips, because obviously they're the most impressionable group, right? The kids, especially with like middle school age, when they're actually understanding what's going on, and it's not just a loud, scary boat when they're 5 years old. But is I try to kind of make it relatable. So you can talk about water flow and sheet flow and levees and dikes and canals and all that, and the impact that agriculture has on the waterways and industrial waste, and even our own practices at home by fertilizing our yards, things like that. But a lot of that kind of goes over their head. Even the average adult, it doesn't really connect. You have to connect it to their life. So we talk about just general how watersheds in general are affected by everything we do on land, and that how that in turn also affects our oceanic life, because all rivers, eventually find their way out to sea. So especially with the kids, I tell them little tips they can do at home about, using natural fertilizers like, manure and things like that instead of chemicals, not dumping junk down the drain or on the ground, turning off the water for a moment while you're taking a shower and save a couple gallons of water here and there, stuff like that. But yeah, you kind of have to make it somewhat relatable. So also like on a private tour, I'm with a family, say from, New York, I try to ask them about their natural terrain, and then kind of compare and contrast what we have here versus what they have here. So they kind of have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Because a lot of times you can talk about a marsh. People really don't know what a marsh is unless they've seen it. And even then seeing it doesn't always make sense. They're only seeing a small fraction of the thousands of square miles of Everglades. So you can kind of talk a little bit about the changes in elevation and how some areas are more forested and other areas are more coastal and brackish. And then you can compare that to where they're from. And I find that tends to be the most effective kind of technique I've found.
So you kind of just touch upon this point that oil and waters are related, right? So kind of discuss it a little bit more and tell us what you know about that.
Yeah, so of course, the Everglades historically was known as the river of grass, which realistically nowadays it really isn't a river anymore. It's disjointed, it's compartmentalized, it's been broken up into smaller sections. And I understand why, because there are millions of people that now rely on that flood control and that water supply. But I also know that initially they weren't trying to flood control. They were trying to drain it completely. I know the area where we even operate our tours from the late 1800s to the early 1900s was completely dried out because all they did was dig canals. Really? So all the water went into the canal, and with it being so dry, lots of fires would go out of control. And actually, we now currently don't really have like the tree islands, which were kind of like a haven during wet season for mammals that we used to. We have probably maybe 3 to 4 islands just in our area that we operate. And I know overall in the Everglades, it's about a 70 to 80% reduction in tree islands, which are crucial habitat for deer, fox, even black bears in some cases, where when the water rises, obviously they're going to need dry land somewhere. The other impact, of course, that we all kind of see, it's not as obvious, but things like seeing a lot of cattail growing around. Cattail, they're loading on their trailer. So cattail is different than sawgrass in that sawgrass generally grows very well in the Everglades because historically the Everglades is a nutrient kind of deficient system. It has very low nutrients and it grows very well in that environment. Cattail grows in the opposite environment where there's a lot of nutrition. And most of that nutrition is coming in the way of, cattle runoff and from up in the Kissimmee area, which all comes downstream into the Everglades. And of course, sugar and orange production, which unfortunately they use large amounts of fertilizer because of our poor soil. And then we can see large areas out there where there may be a couple sprigs of sawgrass left, but for the most part, it's dominated by cattails. And then the problem with that, it actually gets pretty complex. It's kind of interesting. One, sawgrass is shorter than cattail, so it allows sunlight to percolate through down and allow other plants to be able to still grow. Cattail gets so tall and so thick that it literally can shade the water so much that other plants can't survive there, and it absorbs all the nutrients for itself. It's very aggressive. The other problem is that when cattails break down differently underwater. Because they're so nutrient rich, they are eaten up by bacteria very rapidly, which then, when it breaks down, creates a very silty soil rather than our normal, very sticky peat, which is typically from very slow decay rather than a very rapid decay. So it actually is changing the floor of the Everglades as well. Yeah. So you'll find areas where it's very dark, thick, black peat, which is typically where sawgrass breaks down, and it can take decades for it to really break down. And even then, if you pull it apart, you can see it's really just plant fibers. It's not even dirt yet. And that's what peat is, really. Whereas where it's dominated by cattails, these are, you scoop it up and it's just like really fine mud. And it's not really able to support root structures of other plants, things like that, as easily because it's not as dense. It's very easily disturbed and very easily moved around.
Wow. And then, so how does so you kind of mentioned how the Kissimmee affects Everglades, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how does whatever's happening in the Everglades affect the Florida Keys, South, etc.?
So the Everglades actually is a multi-part system. The watershed itself actually starts in Kissimmee. There's large amounts of lakes and ponds and swamps that all feed into the Kissimmee River. That flows south into Lake Okeechobee, which then kind of floods into the Everglades. The Everglades is a 30 to 50 mile wide river. It flows south, and then around Miami kind of curves off a little bit towards the southwest. That fresh water is going out into the marine environment. With the building of all of our levee, dikes, and dams, and compartmentalization of the Everglades, and of course, water, flood control, water supply, being kind of taking more precedence than environmental concerns, unfortunately, often means a much reduced water flow of fresh water going into Florida Bay. So they're actually seeing a reduction in freshwater volume and more salinity, which is changing the plant communities in the saltwater environment where manatees and young fish and dolphins and things like that usually feed and graze. They're seeing huge beds of seagrass dying off. Then, of course, any fertilizers that are carried into, from farmlands into the waterways eventually make their way out as well, causing these algae blooms that you'll sometimes see on the east and west coast. And these algae blooms, of course, rob the oxygen and become very toxic when it all dies, which then cause, large fish kills. This last year was one of the worst ones. We had manatees and dolphins and all kinds of things washing up on the west coast of Florida. And, of course, the Keys are all coral reefs and everything, so that has a big impact.
So you're mentioning kind of like, these other radical changes in plant communities and, and environmental communities. It's like you mentioned the cattails example. And then any other kind of examples?
We also have, of course, not just with plants, animals too. We all know, invasive species are kind of in the news in the last 10 years, particularly the, Burmese python. I don't have any issue with people not liking that they're here. Unfortunately, they get kind of all the attention because it's a big, giant, scary snake. And it is impactful for sure because it's a large predator. They're going to eat a lot of the same types of food that an alligator would eat or that a bobcat would eat. So it's competition plus the possibility of introducing, new pathogens or diseases to our own snake population. But also, of course, there's iguanas. There's all types of fish that are introduced to the area. And even things like feral cats that most of us don't even think of as an invasive species, but they kill and eat everything. But as far as plants go, we have a large amount of what's called Brazilian pepper. It's basically like a weed. That's what right there, actually. That thicker trunk. That's Brazilian pepper. We do our best. We go through about once every 6 months and just remove as much as we can.
Wow.
But it's very aggressive, and it can actually grow to the point where all this other vegetation you see around you would be taken over by Brazilian pepper. And that's just one of numerous types of climbing vines and things like that are actually almost like able to suffocate other plant life. Then, of course, you start changing the plant communities, especially things like in the water, like sawgrass and cattails. Then you also start affecting not only the food chain, but nesting abilities. And like I said, the soil quality and things like that also are affected by that as well. We have a system that worked the same way it has for 5,000 years, but in a very short period of time, it's been greatly, disrupted.
So discuss the role of seagrass, right? In this area, I'm not sure if there's any specifically where you're at right now, but discuss kind of its role in the Everglades overall and kind of why that's important.
You mean sawgrass or seagrass?
Both.
So sawgrass is a plant. It's actually a sedge, not a grass, but sawgrass is easier to say. When you say sausage, everyone gets hungry. But sawgrass actually grows on ridges in the wetland area. So there's slightly elevated areas that actually during dry season do actually have no water. Where in between these ridges, these sloughs, as we call them, these lower lying areas will stay wet. So any fish that might be amongst the grass during dry season are kind of forced into these little holes of water. But those dry areas full of sawgrass then become the nesting grounds for a lot of the alligators, the turtles, the birds, the animals that need to get out of the water to nest. Sawgrass also does go to seed twice a year, and those seeds are edible. The grass itself doesn't really have a lot of nutrition, but those seeds do feed a lot of our smaller birds and smaller animals as well. And then mainly it's the actual habitat. So when you're driving around on a boat and you're in a pathway or a slough that's quite open and there's not a lot of thick, tall grass, but on either side of you, that's where the wildlife's at. They're hiding because there's always something bigger than them trying to eat them. Right? There's always an osprey overhead or a larger fish or an alligator. So a lot of the wildlife reside amongst the actual vegetation itself. So again, a big impact on the vegetation. Again, right behind that is going to be an impact on the wildlife that utilize that vegetation to survive. Seagrass, I'm not as well versed on seagrass, but I do understand in very shallow areas in Florida Bay especially, it could be miles offshore and still only be 10 feet of water. And these grass beds, you've probably, if you've ever gone snorkeling or while you're down in the Keys, you see it's a shorter grass, about, a few inches long to about a foot tall, and there's a lot of it covering the ground. That is a huge food source. And again, also literally actual habitat for a lot of those kind of close to shore wildlife type animals, crabs, lobsters, of course, even dolphins. That we actually have resident dolphins in Florida. So some dolphins migrate and move around, but we actually have dolphins that stay year round in certain areas, Tampa, Clearwater, all over the place. And then, of course, the manatees, of course, which are already critically endangered species. I think recently have been bumped up to threatened, but that's still not good. And those grasses are their primary source of food.
So you kind of mentioned the role of nutrients, right, and how they're connects and how excessive nutrients play a pretty substantial role in the Everglades. Kind of discuss that and where do you think they come from?
Well, I'm sorry, say it one more time.
So discuss of the role of excessive nutrients like phosphorus.
Yes, actually. Yeah, so things like phosphates, phosphorus, nitrates, of course, is all things that are probably pretty familiar for people who have gardens or like to keep a nice green lawn. So unfortunately, because Florida soil is nutrient kind of deficient, it requires a large amount of fertilizer for farming. You may not know this, but historically, homestead was where winter vegetables came from. So if back in the 40s and 50s, if you lived in Wisconsin and you ate, watermelon or tomatoes, it came from homestead. And of course, that's the southern part of the Everglades. But of course, just south of Lake Okeechobee, it's an area known as the Everglades Agricultural Area. And basically, it's miles and miles and miles of sugarcane. Sugarcane, unfortunately, does have a lot of money in their pocket, and they are able to utilize that money to sway certain politicians, things like that, in their favor. So doing things like freely just fertilizing as much as they want without any kind of repercussions as far as the water quality running into the canals and out into the Everglades afterwards, but also being able to just burn entire fields. And albeit not a natural habitat, there are lots of wildlife that live amongst those areas, rabbits and birds of all different species, owls, and even alligators, things like that live in the canals surrounding them. So then you have, of course, also just the air pollution as well. The same thing as you get further up into central Florida, you have a large amount of cattle. Florida is actually probably second, if not third, in beef production. And cattle, of course, have a practice of, using the restroom quite often. And unfortunately, that leaches into our water as well, impacting the nutrient levels as well. So anytime you increase those nutrients is where you get these algae blooms and changes in the landscape, and how vegetation that normally does grow there but very sparse, like cattails, can kind of explode and become a big problem.
What was my ask you? So has your business been affected by these kind of increasing nutrients?
So not really directly, but I will say that, there are areas that we used to drive to that would be covered in sawgrass and little small bushes and trees, and it would see more abundant birds in that particular spot, not necessarily overall. But now you go there and it's nothing but cattail and there's nothing else there. And again, it changes the ability for wildlife to be able to actually survive there or not. So we do see sometimes changes in numbers and the amount of birds that we see in certain areas, and the insect populations, of course, are greatly affected. But more, I think, that a lot of people don't realize with things like sirens, which are actually an amphibian, and it kind of looks like an eel and a catfish put together. Frogs, things like that. These snails, these are a lot more impacted by water quality because they live directly in it. And being amphibious or amphibians, they actually breathe both air and through their skin. And so any chemical changes in the water could also have an impact on the numbers of those animals or their health, I guess you could say. A lot of places around the world that are studying water quality, frogs are their indicator. You start having frogs born with, extra legs or, not able to reproduce, things like that, is because of most likely chemical or fertilizer contamination, typically.
And you're, 16 years of doing this business, right? In your time growing up in this area, what what if any market declines in the species or habitat have you seen in the last time?
Generally, it's a decline in the overall like mammal and bird population due to invasive populations of both feral cats and of course Burmese pythons, but also just a big change when you go out into these native habitats and an area that's supposed to have certain types of plants and trees now has a completely different look to it. And so that's really the big thing. When I go hiking and camping and backpacking out in big cypress, big chunks of land that were normally all cypress domes, logged out completely, which to a degree I understand. We do have a need for paper and wood and things like that. But you have areas that were, had trees that were, 6 feet across and 90 feet tall, and now it's only new growth. And so these trees are much, much younger, much smaller, and it doesn't support the same type of wildlife as far as, black bears, panthers, things like that it would have probably, say, 100 years ago.
Do you have any questions about that?
Yeah, how far do you travel when you're on the boat?
Okay.
Do you travel on the same routes, or do you take different routes all the time?
So yeah, actually, that's kind of a good question. A lot of people ask about like the routes and the trails and the pathways and things like that. We do try to stick to existing pathways or at least open bodies of water, so we're not cutting through vegetation and running over wildlife and plowing through, but also making new paths that are unnecessary when there's already existing trails to use. So we do try to limit our impact. When the waters do get low and patches of mud become exposed, those are often where a lot of birds will actually nest. So we'll try to avoid those areas as much as possible. Or if we do need to go near them, we go slower so we're not washing them away or even waking and pushing eggs off into the water. So our general admission tours typically is kind of about a 5 to 10 square mile area, and it's about a 3 to 4 mile round trip because it's about a 30-minute ride. On our longer tours, or 1 to 2 hours, we travel anywhere from about 25 to 40 miles total distance actual traveled in an area that's about 30 to 40 square miles. Same thing though, we do try to stick to kind of predictable pathways for more than one reason. One, safety. There's other boaters out here, it's public water, so they kind of know our routes and they kind of avoid us and we avoid them. But also just so we're not having a huge impact and just driving all over the grass and the vegetation and, basically just leaving a big empty hole where there used to be plants.
Yeah. Are there any impacts just on the boats themselves, just having them on the water?
Not really. So, for the most part, as long as it's an airboat is specifically designed for both vegetation filled and also very shallow water. Okay. So really it comes down to the operation of the boat and how much impact you're going to have. Of course, there's a little bit of noise, but it's pretty quick. If you were sitting stationary and I passed by, you'd hear me coming, but it wouldn't be super loud for just a few seconds when I passed by. And then once we're gone, and most of the wildlife I find, birds fly away and then they land a few hundred yards away. And then by the time we're gone, nobody's coming through again for a while. We're not having boats go out so frequently that it's a constant disruption. And the same thing with alligators. We'll see them kind of swim away. And then once we're past and already leaving, I'll look back and they just stop swimming and they settle back down and relax again. And then other than that, it's mainly, like I said, trying to avoid areas that are a little bit more sensitive as far as nesting birds, ground-dwelling animals. During certain times of the year, water levels may shift up or down. So we always have to kind of take that into consideration. Also, when areas are dry and have no water, not operating in those areas. So we're not just, removing soil and changing the actual ground itself.
So you just discussed, some of the strategies you could implement to keep the environment intact. Are these policies that, you've kind of implemented, or these kind of general rules that other tour guides tend to follow?
So where we operate in the Everglades out here is technically non-navigable waters. So they're basically only governed as far as law enforcement goes, by the local sheriffs and also Florida Fish and Wildlife. So we're not in Coast Guard waters. There's no channels. There's no markers. There is no set route that you have to take. We realistically could just drive wherever we wanted to. So for the most part, those are practices that we have adopted. And we are now required as of 2019 for commercial airboaters, in other words, people who are for hire to take an airboat out, are required to have a specific airboat certification course. And part of that course does touch on, responsible boating and not impacting wildlife, as well as residential areas. If you're traveling through a lake that's surrounded by houses, keeping your speed down so that you're not making a lot of noise. Airboats are noisy things. It's like I said, it's a backwards airplane on a boat, so it's going to make a little noise. And then, of course, other things like, we're upgrading to newer engines. The engines that we've been using for the last 10 years or so are finally kind of starting to wear down, and also technology has changed. So these newer motors are more fuel efficient. They're less likely to have, oil leaks and things like that. So, and then we're very conscientious and very careful about if we do have a situation where there is a gas or oil leak, we immediately are servicing that so it doesn't get into the water. We'll turn off our bilge pumps and we'll actually, clean out the inside of the boat, clean off the motor, and then of course, like I said, switching over to a better, newer, more technologically advanced motor allows us to also avoid those situations and save gas a little bit too.
So in your kind of community, right? I'm assuming you probably know other airboat operators,
Oh yeah,
etc.
absolutely.
What's kind of the consensus in terms of what needs to be done to kind of save the Everglades? In terms of business practices.
Yeah, absolutely. So one, of course, is just limiting our impact as much as possible. We're going to be out there on boats. They're going to be driving around in the natural environment, but just doing your best to try to leave as little trace as possible, right? I practice the same when I'm camping and fishing and hiking out in the woods. It's like I was never there. Once I pack up my tent and everything, you couldn't even tell I was there in the first place. Sticking to pathways, things like that. They like to make some noise. Some are louder than others. Some like it loud, Me, I'm quiet as I could possibly be. When you're turning an 80-inch prop, it's going to make a little noise. That's actually where most of the noise comes from, is the propeller. Because the engine itself has mufflers on it, just like a car. All right, I think he's done.
It's part of the ambiance.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I know a lot of other airboat operators that are very similar in the way we practice things, as far as keeping their engine in tip-top shape so that they don't run into environmental issues and leaks and things like that. Operating the boat in a safe manner so that not only are other boaters not at risk, but also the wildlife and the surrounding vegetation. But I also know that not necessarily as people out running airboats for business, but just pleasure. People that are out on their airboats, I often can see the remnants of someone who did not care where they were going, and I can see pathways that were cut through grass and things like that. And people driving around all willy-nilly, just like they do in their cars, not really caring about what their impact is on their surroundings. I think realistically, the consensus amongst most boat captains in South Florida, regardless of airboat, fishing charter, trolling motor, whatever, it's basically to try to restore the natural flow of the Everglades. Obviously, we still need to maintain flood control for the eastern coastal area where millions of people live and rely on flood control. But to try to open up some of these levees and to try to fill in some of these canals and the projects that are ongoing right now with Highway 41 being elevated in large sections to allow the water to freely flow instead of going through small pipes and culverts and canals. Same thing with I-75. These are basically like large dams cutting right across the Everglades. And, back when they were built, they thought this is amazing. We can get to the other side of the state without having to go all the way up and around, through the northern part. I don't think they really thought about the impact at the time. We know a lot better now. And then, of course, things like, I think stricter controls and agriculture and the water that comes out of their fields and into the natural areas needs to be, I think, addressed. And I believe some of it actually is happening. I know that new projects are in place right now where they're setting aside land that is going to basically take the water from farmland and kind of filter it out using natural plants and things like that are very good at removing those excess nutrients and then being kind of monitored before it's then discharged into the Everglades. And then the other half of that is removing some of those levees and removing some of those canals so that the water can kind of begin or resume its natural flow like it did 150 years ago, which is more like a sheet. They're just gently flowing across a very flat area. And what that would also help is these discharges from Lake Okeechobee that have to go east and west when the water is too high, which that lake in particular is for generations been filled in with phosphates and nitrates and things like that. That's what causes these large algal blooms in the West Coast and sometimes even on the East Coast. And so I think that's a pretty big chunk of what really needs to happen. And then just general consensus of the average person. And I don't think it's just here. I think this is really nationwide, global, really. I mean, we all need to be able to live the way we do now in modern society with agriculture. We're not living in the forest and nomadic tribes and hunting and gathering anymore. But everything that we do as a modern civilization has an impact on our surroundings. So how can we minimalize that? Or how can we do it in a way where it's not going to be as far spread and more localized?
So kind of discuss a little bit, the collaboration you believe you think needs to happen among different stakeholders, right? So it's like you're a business person, right? You have the average person, you have politicians, you have farmers. It's like, what's the best way, do you think, to kind of find that balance?
Get a little political here for a second.
No,
I'm not going to go too far because I don't want to ruffle any feathers. I know everyone's got their opinions on it, but really at the end of the day, and it's kind of an issue with our politics, but also everything else, it comes down to money. Realistically, everything is what is what is the impact on my pocket? And I'm not gonna. I mean, I run a business, so I know how that works. But at the same time, we try to run a business where we can make a profit, we can provide jobs for people, and provide a life for people, and put food on their table, but still also, be responsible in how we operate. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of these, entities, whether it be governmental or agricultural or, local municipalities, even, it all comes down to their bottom line, and how much profit am I going to make? And if I do have to alter anything because of environmental factors, how is that going to cut into that profit? And I think if we could kind of move past that and realize we can still make a living, but also be environmentally friendly, or at least more environmentally friendly than we currently are. I think that's probably where a lot of it comes down to. And it's the root of all evil, right? It's the root of everything bad in our world is money.
So I guess that kind of leads to my next question is, how do you define sustainability?
Basically, like I was saying, is to be able to actually do what you're doing with having as little impact as possible on the area. A negative impact, of course. A positive impact is always better. That would obviously be a even better than just sustaining. Is even being able to actually improve your area or whatever it is you're doing, whether it's in town or out in the middle of nowhere. We do little things here. Like we've been slowly transitioning to trying to plant only native plant life. We've actually planted over 50 cypress trees in the area. Little things like, when we find injured wildlife, trying to rehabilitate them and then re-release them back into the wild. Educating the locals that come and visit our animal exhibits and talk about why we have a python and an African tortoise in our exhibit, because they were formerly pets that were released into the wild. So hopefully some of those people are less likely to either get that pet, or if they do, at least be responsible about it. To me, that's how it works for us here. Obviously, in a farm situation or, offshore fishing or drilling, it's doing it as cleanly as possible. When it comes to fishing, is knowing when to say when and not take all the fish. And of course, even farming is working with the environmentalist groups and the water control people, instead of, seeing them as an enemy, see them as someone who can help you run your business and still make a profit, but also have little impact on your environmental area around you.
And, and what is the term sustainable development entail?
Basically is further growing our current situation, our current, civilization in a way that, again, either improves or at least does not negatively impact the surrounding, wildlife and vegetation and waterways, especially the water, because everything, whether it's plants, animals, or you and me, we all need that water.
The term conservation gets thrown around a lot, especially nowadays. How do you interpret that as a business owner, right? And then, and what do you think that means?
Obviously, conservation is often used one way or another, but generally speaking, I think conservation is taking an area of whatever wildlife and nature you have, whether it be in the mountains or the desert or down here in the swamps, and trying to preserve what is there. Again, if you can improve upon or, rectify issues that have happened in the past and make them better, and kind of maybe even revert some of these areas back to what they once were. But at minimum is at least protecting the area from further development and further impact from all kinds of pollution and human traffic and things like that.
Fantastic. Do you have any questions, Adolfho?
I think you did a good job.
You doing that?
I'm doing my best.
Thank you very much.
Well, I guess we'll kind of end this interview. Is that to anybody that's listening right to the world, what do you have to say? No pressure.
Yeah. Obviously, just think about your everyday life, and everything we do has an impact on our surroundings. Every river, lake, the ocean, every body of water is what sustains all of us, from the bird talking behind you to you and me sitting here. We are the water. The water is in us. We're made of water. So we need to protect our waterways as much as possible, because that in turn will protect other areas like our oceans and our reefs and our forests that all rely on that water as well. And talk to your politicians locally, talk to your, waste managements, your different, organizations that help to monitor these situations, but also the people who are impacting it. Write letters, talk to, people that can make a change. Unfortunately, a lot of that comes down to money. So if you have it, spend it wisely, give the right people the money to try to make that change and to try to conserve more lands, or at minimum, keep any more damage from happening.
Absolutely. Well, I think with that concludes the interview. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. My pleasure. Thank you.
Of course.
All right.